So welcome everyone. My name is Kathleen Lane. I am the Executive Director of the EdCan Network and your host for today's conversations on systems that approach well-being or systems that support well-being. The EdCan Network is a national education charity that connects education professionals and researchers from across the country to share research, expertise, and to have a supportive network as we work to strengthen education, learning, well-being in our schools across the country. We publish free evidence-informed tools and resources and host a wide variety of virtual events such as this one to share learning and expertise. Our work takes place on the traditional territories of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people who have stewarded and cared for these lands for generations. As we get started today, please take a moment to reflect on where you're joining from and the opportunities and lessons that the land offers you. So today's conversation really looks at a systemic approach to well-being. And I have 5 different panelists from 5 different roles across the country. So I'll call on Charlie Naylor, one of our Well at Work advisors, to introduce himself first. Charlie, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was waiting for Rosa. My apologies. Hi, my name's Charlie Naylor. I work with EdCan. I'm currently working with a school district in British Columbia, and I've worked across a few different provinces. Before that, I worked as a researcher with the BC Teachers Federation in Vancouver for some time before they threw me out and pretended I retired.
Thank you so much, Shirley. All right, I'll hand it over to Rosa Gray, another one of our Well at Work advisors.
Hey, everyone. Good morning. In addition to being a Well at Work advisor for EdCan, I coach school and system leaders on staff and student well-being. I have a particular interest in how holistic approaches for well-being are designed, implemented, and integrated across school systems. And that's related to my doctoral dissertation, where my research focuses on working with school system leaders to understand how to create the conditions for large-scale change to enhance student well-being. And I also bring a practitioner lens because I've worked in senior leadership for most of my career as an educator.
Lovely. Thank you, Rosa. All right, Christina MacKinnon, I will hand it over to you. You're a senior leader in the system right now.
Good morning, everyone. I'm presently an assistant superintendent in Sherwood Park, Alberta. I have systemic wellness in my portfolio. My experiences in wellness range from being an advocate and fitness instructor, phys ed teacher for a long time, and focusing on student, staff, and community wellness, and a director of innovation and wellness as well. I'm currently working on staff and student wellness in our division, focus on system wellness, which means our big focus this year was staff workload, role clarity, optimizing meetings, and currently working on admin procedures for wellness as well, and embedding social emotional learning and preconditions for learning in our assurance plans. So
amazing. Thank you so much. And bringing a slightly different lens from Ontario and a union perspective, Simon Dallimore.
Thank you very much. So my name is Simon. I used to like to say, oh, you know, my name is Simon, but the things I draw don't come true. And those people who smiled at that, I knew their certain age bracket of where they belonged. So my name is Simon. I am an elementary teacher. I still call myself an elementary teacher. I started teaching grade 8 and I worked my way backwards. And the last grade I taught was grade 5. From there, I represented the elementary teachers in Waterloo for the Ontario English Catholic Teachers Association in Waterloo. And most recently, I'm working for the provincial office of OECTA in the Counselling and Member Services Department. And my portfolio right now includes providing as much mental health and wellness supports to our local units as possible, as well as our individual members who are looking for some resources and ways that they can support themselves in their role. So thank you.
Wonderful. And bringing a research lens, many of you will know of Dennis Shirley from some of his work. Dennis, I'll hand it over to you to finish introducing yourself.
Thank you, Kathleen. Yes, my title is Research Professor at Boston College. I believe I've been invited to join this discussion because I co-authored a book with Andy Hargreaves, who you all will know well, I believe, entitled Wellbeing in Schools. That book was based on research in 10 school boards in Ontario. And it came out at a very good time because of all the international evidence that our kids and our educators today are struggling in many regards. Currently, I spend a lot of time working with the Bosch Foundation in Germany. You may know Bosch. They make machine parts, dishwashers, refrigerators, and with another foundation called the International Movement Towards Educational Change, which is based in Oslo, Norway. So I work a lot with those foundations, trying to retire and failing.
That's what happens when work is too interesting. To get us started into today's conversation, there's a lot of conversation right now about the role of education in supporting well-being, both of our students and of our staff in the system. And Dennis, I'm going to hand it back to you. Based on all of your research and your work, what is the role of education in supporting well-being?
Well, it's central. We often kind of think of education as a transmission of content knowledge. But especially at the elementary level, we understand it's famous, right? Elementary school teachers teach children, and then when they get in secondary, they teach subjects, right? So this is a fundamental challenge that we have as a profession, and maybe what we need is more content in elementary and more human-centered approaches at secondary. We could have some discussions about that. And that's interesting for us because it immediately gets into teachers' identities and how we represent ourselves to our students and to the world. The research that Andy and I did looked a lot. There's all kinds of different models that the different boards in Ontario had come up with for well-being. This was, kind of back in the day now, the research was, at this point it's about, 8 to 10 years old. But there was a while where well-being was one of the 4 provincial priorities for education in Ontario. And so we were invited in to look at how are these boards trying to implement the policy. And we saw a lot of really good things that were going on. So trying to use new technologies responsibly, getting our young people so that they had apps that were actually designed in some schools where young people could report to a school counselor if they were concerned about a colleague, any number of really good things that were going on. Researchers kind of like to do 3 things. They like to look at what are the big theories on well-being, what's the contemporary research, and what is our own research? What do we find from looking at schools? And so doing those things, Andy and I kind of saw 3 things that educators we would encourage everybody to be thinking about. The first one, it has to do with inclusion. So inclusion and equity are absolutely enormous for a sense of well-being. Very, very hard for anybody to feel like an outsider. And this goes back to your key word there, Kathleen, systemic. Okay, so what are we doing to make sure that as many of our kids as possible feel that they have a sense of belonging in school? Okay, from the most diverse backgrounds, but often kids from majority backgrounds don't feel welcome. They feel like oddballs. So the first one is we use the term social prosperity, different term than inclusion or equity, and we explain that in the book. The second one, everybody's concerned with now with digital addictions and what they're doing to our young people. And so we kind of try and come up with some models for responsible digital use of computers in schools and things we need to be aware of outside. I can go more into that later on. And then the third thing is a lot of the models of well-being don't attend very much to physical well-being. Physical well-being, and you were talking about the land earlier, Kathleen. So having a connection to the land and pursuing physical excellence. It's really hard to be depressed or anxious if you're just really feeling magnificent about your body. And, one of the fun things that I'm doing in retirement is taking dance classes. I'm learning salsa and bachata, and it's fun. And you look into the research, and it's just like really good for you because to be a good dancer, you can't slump. You have to be up, right? And all of a sudden, my posture changes and how I move in the world, and it's very pro-social. So thinking about social prosperity, aka equity and inclusion, thinking about how we're using digital tools and not just saying, hey, there's AI now, let's use that. That's wonderful. Not just taking that route. And third, kind of making sure that we pay attention to young people's physical well-being. And I think that that also could be a connection there to your land acknowledgement earlier in indigenous cultures where
For
that
sure.
matters. Not a back issue. Thank you for giving me all that
Yeah,
airtime. I'll stop now.
absolutely. I think you've got a great foundation for us. I'm going to hand it over to Christina because you mentioned you're thinking about a lot of these pieces within your role, thinking about systemic well-being at your school division. How does this reflect kind of your thoughts on the role of education and fostering well-being? Oh, you're muted, Christina.
That's such a loaded question, right? So, like, where do you start with it with wellness in schools? So we truly believe as a school system, systemic wellness is students don't learn if they're not doing well. So what does that look like? So we have 4 priorities in our assurance plan, and we're really intentionally trying to put the social emotional learning pieces in our plan in terms of in our systemic wellness priority, but also our learners and learning priority and our faith priority. So how does wellness go across all of our priorities? Student wellness, knowing that it's a precondition, looking at the safety and belonging and what that looks like. So really being intentional in our language. So if our goal is that to make sure that every student feels like when they walk into the building, they feel safe and they belong, what does that look like? And how can we make that happen? So that could be, we are intentionally going to be greeting students by name for all of September and October, being at the door before the students get to class. What difference would that make? So, what small changes can we make as a school division? Systemically, I work really closely. We don't work in isolation. We do collaborative response models where we look at what is our schools looking like at the school level. So we have student support teams and they look at the wellness in their own buildings and then we talk. So a system is, no one's working in isolation. Our directors are working with our schools. How can we support student learning? What does that look like for school counselors? What does that look like for community services? What does that look like for family partnerships? What does that look like in differentiation and making sure that we're meeting students where they're at? All of this is wellness. There's none of this that is not wellness. And, when working on a new admin procedure right now, really intentionally putting in that, the movement is actually a co-regulation. So you cannot take phys ed away. You do not take away movement from children because children don't learn if they aren't regulated. So why would we take away the biggest regulator, which is moving? And so taking a look at all of those pieces as a system, that's what we're doing right now. And intentionally putting that language in there and working with social emotional learning across the board.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I know we've focused a little bit more on the students so far, so I'm going to turn it over to Simon. And I know your focus is more on the staff well-being and the educators. From your perspective, what is the role of education and well-being?
Thank you. And I was jotting down a few notes because I really appreciate what the first 2 speakers shared. And I heard, not working in isolation, the importance to collaborate, that all students need to feel welcomed. And I absolutely, and the research that we look at as well shows all of that, the importance of that. But oftentimes, I think what we forget sometimes are the education workers in some of that conversation. 100% students need, there's no argument, right? We're there for the students. But when I get to talk to teachers, when they're feeling burnt out, when they're having some challenges with what they're doing, when they're not feeling that support, I often hear from them that they feel like they're isolated, that they don't feel like they're part of a community that's responding. And I think, when I meet with teachers who are struggling, and they say, but I need to be there for my students. Their students are the group of kids that are sitting in front of them, and they love those students, and they want to be there for those students. I have to remind them sometimes you need to be there for yourself first before you can be there fully for your students. And once you're there for yourself, and I think a system that recognizes that we need to support those teachers with the physical activity, with some of the wellness activities for teachers as well, with some of the resources that are available, that is all part of a systems approach. We work with the teachers and the educators who are on the ground, who are calling for these supports, and they can model it for their students as well when they're in the classroom. They can model what well-being looks like. They can model mindfulness when they're in that classroom as well, because they're in a good space to help those students. So from my perspective, it's collaborating with all stakeholders in education to say, how can we make it a systems approach, and how can we help to support those educators
Fantastic.
who are telling us they need.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to Charlie now. I know you've been working with a number of different school systems across the country. How are the school systems you're working with, and you in your own work, conceptualizing the role of education and supporting well-being?
Well, I think my work is primarily focused on staff. It's not student focused, and I'm not sort of putting down the student focus. I'm just saying that my work does focus completely on staff. I think one of the most difficult things for a lot of school districts has been to argue the case for well-being of staff. I think a lot of people think teachers have it easy. A lot of people don't think about people other than teachers in the education system. They don't think about the well-being of principals, education assistants, bus drivers, and so on. So there are a couple of things going on. One is the difficulty of pitching the well-being of staff, and clearly the answer is not that complex. It's, if you do not have well staff, you cannot well serve your students. It's as simple as that, and it's an easy case to make in logical terms, but it's a tricky case to make when people say you finish work at 3 and you've got 2 months off in the summer, both of which are nonsensical quite often, but it's a perception. So I think part of the way that systems are looking at the role of education is, how do we optimize performance? How do we optimize humanity in our system to ensure that teachers and all workers are operating to their optimum and are living optimally with wellness as part of their existence? So I think it's a very general picture, but I think it's also a tricky one to pitch, if you will, to communities and to people who pay for education.
Absolutely. And then, Rosa, you're integrating all of these different perspectives into your doctoral research. From where you are right now, what is the role of education in supporting well-being?
Thanks, Kathleen. I'd begin by saying that while recent research clearly identifies that student and staff well-being is kind of declining nationally and internationally, and that this has created pressure for school divisions to respond to having like a systemic approach to well-being, it's less clear that school divisions are actually fully embracing this responsibility. Like Christina's provided us solid examples of what it looks like when a division does, but many are not so wholeheartedly in embracing this. And I think part of the answer could be because of funding. I think that's what someone would explain as the answer, but I think it's actually quite a bit more than that. I think it's that we're not really clear on what this looks like in practice at different levels of the education system. And without a clear understanding of the change that is expected, educators kind of default to, well, we're doing this already, or it's not our job. Mm-hmm. And so the first step is to build understanding of what it means to move beyond shared concern and good intentions to action that meaningfully changes conditions. And this requires, in my view, that we acknowledge that well-being is a precondition, to Christina's point, to learning, but also that it's a core outcome of education and therefore a core responsibility. That the current organization of schools can't be relied upon to meet the scale of the needs that we currently have, and that well-being can't be addressed after academic priorities, nor can it be resolved through additional programs. Currently, that's the most common approach, is just to kind of layer on into our already burdened structures, or to consider staff and student well-being separately. Instead, a systems approach, in my view, needs to rethink how schools are organized, using a deliberate reprioritization that aligns practice, expectations, resources, and leadership, so that attention to well-being is foundational and to everyday operations.
Can you go a little bit deeper into what that systems approach to well-being looks like? And maybe if you have a couple of examples that you've already encountered in your practice or in your research, Rosa.
Okay, so some of the systems approaches I would say that makes it foundational to system design requires like a coordinated action across multiple parts of the system. And I think about this as operating on kind of three interdependent dimensions. First, multi-level coordination. A systems approach works simultaneously at the school, classroom, division, and provincial levels, each with distinct areas of responsibility, and it requires coherence across departments and staff groups so that we don't have fragmentation and isolation, which is actually really common in schools. So at the school level, what this includes, and I'm thinking about student well-being, is like evidence-informed practices and a focus on whole school approaches and whole school climate. At the division level, it's about strategic direction, resource allocation and capacity building. And at the provincial level, this is about political will and policy frameworks and funding. So a systems approach also requires that we have infrastructure and processes across the system, and this requires that we rethink leadership. Some approaches, system approaches, move away from kind of top-down, policy-driven or professional development-driven approaches towards greater collaboration across levels and shared responsibility. And I've heard that this idea around shared responsibility and collaboration mentioned already. But to speak more deeply about the leadership part, the leadership requires distributed, coordinated, and intentional at every level of the system. It requires advisory structures that connect stakeholders, clear pathways and protocols, and provide appropriate resourcing, and of course, ongoing monitoring and support. And when we think about systems, the other thing I would say, and I know I'm talking fast because I'm getting excited, but it's like that we need to embrace that systems are complex. A system by definition has lots of little subsystems. And when we think about changing systems, we need to acknowledge that change is nonlinear and that outcomes emerge from the interactions of people, structures, and the local context. And small actions can have large effects and early decisions can create momentum. So ultimately, a systems approach creates readiness through motivation and capacity, which I'll address in another question.
Yeah, amazing. Christina, I'm going to hand it back to you. Rosa's spoken about a lot of the theoretical aspects, and I know your school division's doing a lot of this work. Can you help bring it to life and provide some more examples of what this looks like within your school division?
Sure, and without going into so many details that it's not going to be something tangible for whoever's on this presentation today. When we think about where to start, we do role model. Role modeling it as a system leader is super important, and putting what we say into practice into an admin procedure as well. And so, even the communication for a system, when you think about, I'm going to staff right now, staff wellness, to say that, we are giving permission not to have to respond to emails an hour after work and an hour before work. And we will also do that. So we honor what we say, and then we put that into writing, we practice it. And then other things, for example, is the importance of connection before getting into business. So people come first, work comes second. So that's also a condition for learning for adults. So what kind of connection activities can you put into place at the beginning of every meeting? Whether that's something that, like this morning, we threw a ball of yarn around, and I threw a ball of yarn to the, and this is senior admin, the strengths that I recognize in you, and thank you for helping me out. So recognizing the strengths in each person, and you throw the ball of yarn, they catch it, and it keeps on going. And then you see how we're all connected and that we don't work in isolation in an agency. And same thing in the school. Teachers need other teachers. There's strengths in a school, there's strengths in a division, and the strengths in a classroom. So that's a great activity to do with students. And to see how we're all connected and we don't work in isolation, and we're one body moving forward in one direction for the same reason. And so to add those social emotional learning pieces into practice is super important, and to role model it. We've also worked on optimizing meetings. So, what's an information item? What's a memo? What actually needs to be spoken to? Because people who are at the table in a meeting, everyone has important business to do. For example, if you have a meeting for certain people and it doesn't pertain to certain departments, can they just have a memo and we just meet individually with these people? Because then the others will feel like their time is also being honored. So what's best for one is not always best for all. So that's that equity piece. Also looking at roles and responsibilities, looking at redundancy in roles and crossing lanes when you're in a school or when you're in a division, and over communicating causes a lot of stress in staff. So like we did a rosebud thorns activity, like what's going really well with your role? What's an idea that you really want to get off the ground, that you feel like it's amazing, but there's some barriers here. And what's a thorn that's really stopping me from doing my job? And to discuss that openly in a vulnerable type of meeting setting is, we find very beneficial. And then we take it back, we talk about it, and we come back to them, because that coming back after you meet with a group, or talking with people is super important. It shows that you've listened to them and you're putting things in practice. So that's what we're doing with staff right now. And for students, we're really trying to embed that parent partnership into our practices. So example, when we do formative assessments, what are the conversations that we're having with parents? Because again, teachers don't work in isolation. How can we get those parents more on board and to see effective learning? We always talk about, we're not in the teaching business, we're in the learning business. So if students aren't learning, what are the barriers to learning? And that takes parents, that takes community, and that takes teachers, and that takes conversations. So we're doing collaborative responses. We have a collaborative response model of, that's a structure that we have across all of our schools, where they are asked to embed this weekly into their schedules to talk about concerns and to get together. So again, teachers don't work in isolation when they come up to issues. So it's just, when you look at a system approach, what are practices that support that system, and what are structures that support that system? And to be consistent with that and clear and role model. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. And we have to recognize that the education system doesn't exist just within a school division. And I know, Charlie, you've been doing a lot of thinking about the role within the school division, how it connects to other organizations within the education sector. So thinking about that, how do we approach systems that support well-being, and how do we foster that collaborative partnership?
I think one of the things I've become more interested in recently are the political and organisational context that impact systems approach to well-being. I mean, BC might be an outlier in its politics on occasions, but it's a heavily politicised system, and on a provincial level, union and provincial government relationships can impact school districts quite significantly. So that's one factor. Within schools, the nature of hierarchy, the nature of hierarchy in the way the school district is organised strikes me as interesting. The relationships within the district between management and unions, and between the school district and its community. I've come across some examples recently with some very difficult interactions between school districts and communities, especially COVID and post-COVID related, and often related to things like sexual orientation, where you get groups really getting, critiquing the school district very strongly for its approaches. So I think some of these political and organisational contexts can be very important. Of course, when you're looking at the system, you're talking about building collaboration and collaborative work between management, unions, and community. And I think maximising that is good. But there's something I'll come on to maybe a bit later. I'll flag it here. One is, and Christina focused very well, I think, on some of the practical things like cutting down emails at evenings and weekends, and a few other factors that we've done also. But I think we tend to focus on some of the issues that we need to address, and we don't focus always on the skills needed to actually make a dent in those issues. So I've also become more interested, and not saying people don't have the skills, but everybody needs to extend their skills. So, for instance, when Christine was talking about meeting processes, how do we do that? What skills do I need? If we are working in a school-based team, how do we collaborate? What team building skills are important? Those kind of things are the skills needed to address the concepts which address systems well-being. So it's a kind of very web-like structure, but it's not actually that complicated. There are issues, there are ways to address them, and there are skills we need to have or to extend in order to address them.
Fantastic. And Simon, this is kind of the space you're working in as well. What would you add?
I think to do any of this, I heard, I think Shirley earlier on talk about political will and the importance of that. And I think that there's a lot of things in place already. So when we look at things like the psychological health and safety standards, of course, they're voluntary. They don't have to be implemented. It's not law, but there's a lot of good things in there. Some of the policies in Ontario that are in the systems are there already, but I don't know if there's the will to implement them. I was working with one board who I won't name at this point. Well, I won't name, period. They wanted to work with wellness, and they recognize the need because they recognize that they see the expense that they're incurring with the number of teachers who are off and the long-term disability and all of that associated with it. And they reached out to say, we need to focus in on this, but we have $0 to do it. What can we do? I think if you're looking at it, and it goes back to that need for that political will to say, how do we support the system? Well, things like the psychological health and safety, it's investing money into the system to say wellness. And I think it was Rosa who talked about that we need systems that support well-being, and it has to be foundational. Attention to well-being is foundational. And I agree, it can't just be an add-on saying, okay, we now need to address this problem. So in Ontario, when we have the incident report forms, when teachers experience violence or they're whatever it is they've experienced in their classroom, is it just a piece of paper that's being filled out, or is there going to be follow through on that? So when we're looking at a system, how would we describe a systems approach? I think when I go back to a lot of the research that EdCan has done as well, when we talk to teachers, they're going to say, I need support here, here, and here, be it smaller classroom sizes, be it educational assistance in the classroom, whatever the case may be. It's a systems approach, so that we're listening to what the teachers are calling for and what they need out of that system, and then taking a look at what's already there. A lot of this is being built, and I've heard people talk about, and I think Rosa I like the way Rosa worded it. We have to have action, right? We can't just keep the status quo. We need to take a look at how we can make those changes. I don't know if that fully answers your question or not, but thank you.
I don't think there is a full answer to what is a systemic approach to well-being yet. So we're gathering all the pieces of it as we build that kind of bigger vision. But you bring up a really important point, which is that political will. And that brings us to the idea of creating the enabling conditions to support well-being in our schools and school systems. So I'm going to bring it back to Dennis. And in all your research you did, I'm sure you uncovered some of the enabling conditions, some of the factors that make this more possible within those school boards that you worked with. So you can share some about that.
Sure. Yeah. So we're talking a lot about professional collaboration, and when it's focused on students and their work and what they're generating and documenting that well, I think that creates a sense of caring in our schools. So interdisciplinary teams, it could include the principal, could include a colleague from a professional association, might include the student, might include a parent. So the first caution I would want to say, though, listening to the conversation, and nobody has said this, but I want to clarify it, a systemic approach does not mean that the people at the top of the system dictate what has to be done to achieve well-being. Okay, just that, I just want to say that very explicitly. I think for me, it's more about creating little ecosystems where people can discuss, some of the social and emotional and physical aspects of human development, and do the problem solving that is responsive to the issues that are emerging, whether it's for the colleagues or whether it's for the students or whether it's for the community. Am I making myself clear there, Kathleen? Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. It is not top down. This is a web. This is about relationships and connections.
Yeah, and this was really interesting. I had a German delegation that went to Vancouver in British Columbia last year, and we were so fascinated because the ministry in British Columbia is really not that big, right? And yet it feels that a lot of the changes that have been driven there have been driven by the professional association, by the colleagues themselves in the schools. Now, I might be romanticizing it a bit, maybe a little bit of window dressing, but we specifically went to British Columbia because we were looking for systems that appeared to be quite democratic, committed to human rights, pluralism, all these really good values. So that's the first thing, though, is like colleagues listening to this, please, if you're in your administration somewhere, please don't think, guys, here's what we need to do. We're going to do well-being, and I'm going to tell you how to do it. Okay, that is one thing I would ask you not to do. Second thing, in terms of the enabling conditions to think of here, is when we think of well-being, please, let's not think of well-being as always being happy, okay? Because you're going to make yourself miserable if we think that well-being is always being happy. And in fact, we had some really interesting conversations with colleagues when Andy and I have done professional development. Part of learning is getting frustrated. In fact, part of learning, I would just say, based on my own experience, involves suffering. You should see me when I'm out there trying to get these salsa steps down. Colleagues, I hit the walls. I'm so frustrated. I can't get it. Okay. I'm moaning and groaning. And it's hard, right? So those of you that like learning foreign languages, one of the things you have to grapple with is the conjugation of irregular verbs. And at some point, you just have to sit down and memorize those monsters. And it's hard. And then you have the breakthroughs, right? So that there is a learning cycle that often involves frustration, can involve suffering, can involve disappointment. Okay. Sometimes it involves humiliation. Okay. I'm telling you, it's not easy at my age to try and learn salsa or bachata. It's hard. Okay. So in our understanding of well-being, it's not always that people are happy. They could be really challenged by something. Now, our job as educators, leaders, staff developers, and all that is to help them to get on the other side. We don't leave them with that frustration. Okay, so there's a couple of enabling conditions here. One is understanding that we're about creating ecosystems and not mandating from the top down. That's one thing. Second thing is having an understanding of well-being, which is open and dynamic and evolving and developmental. Okay, so I think if you have those two things, because then if you're going to get into the ecological approach, you have to have lots of conversations and listen. You can't
Absolutely.
Right? And then if you want to get to well-being that's meaningful and not just, everything is beautiful in its own way, you have to understand a part of being a human being and learning is being frustrated and then getting to the other side of it and experiencing that euphoria. So those are just two thoughts. Never ask a professor a question.
Never ask a professor. That's a great thought, but I am going to bring it over to Charlie because I see he put a couple things in the chat relating to this. Also, bringing the BC perspective. Charlie, over to you.
Well, all I'm saying is I really agree with Dennis about it not being top down, but unless you've got people at the top really both involved and endorsing the approach, it's not going to move very far indeed. And so it was just a minor point there, but I do think one of the things that we've not really got a good handle on is the collaboration at a wide level. When Rosa was speaking about classrooms, teachers working together or staff working together within a school, within a division or a school district, and across on the bigger picture, that level of collaboration is difficult in a system where you have interest-based approaches. So the union has interest-based approaches. The province has approaches which are often financially connected or policy connected. And sometimes it's difficult to get past those interests to actually build rather than be interest focused. And that's a key point with wellness initiatives. You need to practically build and collaborate. You do not need, you keep your positional interest as a union or as management, but you don't, that's not where you stand when you're just doing the wellness. You've got to some extent put that to one side, and you've got to, one of the trickiest things for a union is to shift from the critic to the builder. and it's been tough. I've been on the inside and seen that, and I think it's a tricky position. But if we can do it as management, as unions, as principals, and get into that constructive mode, while not losing the positional interest mode, then I think that's a very positive factor for building wellness and well-being.
Perfect. Thank you. And Christina, I would love if you could add to that around how has that worked well in your division?
Yeah, so as a system leader, like at the senior admin level, we are really focused on making sure wellness is a priority. And, people have asked for time, people have asked for this, people have asked for this. And a key part of this is to be a listener and to see with what in your locus control can you respond with. And so whenever we're intentional in taking in the information, but also coming back to them to say, okay, these are the practices we've changed due to your feedback. How is it going? So, to have that constant communication, that connection with and leading from the middle throughout as a division leader is extremely important. So, it's going well. There's always areas to improve, but we're also focused on building capacity in people and failing forward and making mistakes. And if we have something that we put in place and it's not working well, to come back as a division's okay, let's talk about this. Like, nothing is set in stone as we move forward. Like, we are a growing, ever evolving I guess agency in education. And when you think about that, there's the system leaders at the top, then you have and when I say top, you have system leaders, it's fluid. And then you have your administrators, and then you have your teachers, and then you have your collaborative teams within the schools. So how is that working? We're practicing it at the division level, and we're supporting it being practiced in the schools. So we have people in every school who actually leads these collaborative response meetings to ensure that these are done on a weekly basis. And we do check-ins. So we don't just drop something and let it go. It's almost like formative assessment with students. We're always formatively assessing our own practices with our division. That's super important, and to be a listener and role model. So resilience, changing mindsets, failing forward even as division leaders, looking at digital wellness too, to promote micro connections. So as a division, what is wellness with our devices? What is wellness? And we practice that in our meetings. This is time for laptop down. This is time for laptop up. Let's promote micro connections as opposed to, put away something. So change the language to make it more positive about what we want, and getting away from always saying what we don't want. So, hopefully that's answered your question, Kathleen. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just showing the management commitment. And I'm going to turn it over to Simon. What are some things that can really bring the unions in on that collaborative level?
Thank you. I jotted a note down here, and because I do agree with something that Charlie said, which I think is going to be able to answer this question. Unions, I think the statement was, we got to make sure we shift from critical to being a builder. And I'm going to say that's frustrating, and it's difficult, because and I'm going to go back to that political will, because when you do a number of studies and you do the research and you can look at what is being said in the classroom, and where some challenges are coming from, and you put forth ideas at the local level, when our local union leaders meet with the boards, and they're putting out some ideas that can help with the wellness overall, and they're shot down. It very much feels like it's a top-down approach. So there's this attempt to be a collaborative builder with the local boards, with the local units, as well as at the provincial level, where we're trying to put forward ideas and you're being told no, 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 or it comes down to funding or whatever the case may be. There are times when there's a vacuum where we're going to step in and say, here you go. Here's some programs that we can run because we don't see it being done at this point. And we'd love you to come along with us. Doesn't always work. So I do agree, but sometimes you have to be critical because you see some of the things that are happening when there are already systems in place and they're not being followed or they're not being taken to the extent that they could in order to improve the well-being. And that leads to a lot of frustration. And some of the things that I see that we could do if you're following the psychological health and safety standards, it does talk about the leaders of the system having to buy into it. It only works if the leaders buy in. But then underneath that, we have a number of committees that we can meet with that includes people from all sectors so that you have champions of wellness within all the sectors. And you're listening to what the people say through ongoing surveys, not just for survey's sake, but to say, this is what we are seeing in the schools. This is what this school culture is all about. And this is what we're challenging it. These are our challenges. How do we then address those challenges? So you're consistently measuring and reporting on the well-being and making any necessary changes, which I also heard Charlie and I heard Dennis say as well. It's constantly changing, which I love. I think that's fantastic because I agree. We have to recognize that wellness isn't a set standard. It's different for each individual person. I'm actually at a wellness conference right now, and that statement I've heard over and over again, and I agree 100% with that.
Absolutely.
Each of us is different, and we have to find what works for us. But then each school is different within the system. Each board is different within the province, and you need to recognize that.
Yeah. And, we've heard a lot about, fostering wellness is often about coming together and working together in different ways and learning the skills to do that. Rosa, I know you have some thoughts, and I know your research looks at how do we integrate all of these perspectives. So I'm going to let you have the last thought here. And then in the interest of time, we'll have to wrap up after that. So go ahead, Rosa.
Well, I have something I could say about readiness and a process, but just to honor Indigenous voices, I think I'll just focus on an example from Manitoba's experience. So, and a national example. So a national example is that we can use to help us think about well-being as a systems approach is provided by the Joint Consortium for School Health. In their well-being toolkit, they provide guidance for practices to consider student and staff well-being together so that they're not considered different kind of initiatives, but that we would use some of the same thinking and processes for both at once. And so there's an example that I would draw from that document is psychological well-being practices to be thought through from the perspective of autonomy, social relatedness, and competence. And there are many connections, Christina, here for these issues related to the initiatives that you have underway. In Manitoba, where we've recently released a policy framework for deepening understanding on Indigenous ways of knowing, school divisions are seeing connections between those three ideas and the circle of courage, connecting those ideas to belonging, mastery, independence, and frameworks that emphasize generosity and hope. Another piece that is relevant to a systems approach is that this is about collectivist approaches, not fixing individuals. Right? We talked about how it's at the same time, it's about challenges and building something, but it's also about individuals and a collective approach. And so there's something, I just wanted to bring in what we know about Indigenous teachings about this being collective, holistic, and balanced. And maybe that's where we'll leave the last word.
I love it. Collectivist, balanced. I think that brings in just so much of what well-being really is about: connection, when we get right down to the bottom of it. So you've all given us lots of different perspectives, lots of different ideas to think about as each of us within our own role, our own scope, our own system works towards enhancing well-being for the students, for the staff. So I'd like to thank all our panelists, Dennis, Christina, Rosa, Charlie, Simon. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Thank you to all our guests for joining in. I've enjoyed watching all the chats happen. So thank you, everybody. We invite you all to stay in touch. Make sure you're signed up for EdCan's newsletter. If you're interested in becoming a member, please do so. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.